Not too long ago, we got the leak that FaceID might be coming on a next generation HomePod, and I was like, what? But recently, I figured it out and I've got an idea. So I've had the Google Home Mini recently, and that is not what today's video is about. I'm not reviewing that yet. I would like to talk more about it soon. It's been more pleasant in other ways than I thought it would be, but also kind of weird in other ways, but I don't need to talk too much about that. It's given me a taste of what it's like to have a smart speaker in the home, as I've actually never owned one before, never had an Amazon Echo, never had a Google Home of any kind, but thanks to one of you gracious fans who super chatted and asked me to review it, I am reviewing it now. And it's gotten me to think a lot about what it's like having that in the office, in the living room. It's made me think a lot about having digital assistants and devices that solely run on digital assistants, and it definitely makes me think a lot about how will I like the HomePod. Since I'm an Apple sheep, since I'm biased towards that company, perhaps a lot of the issues I'm having with the Google Home Mini will be fixed by the far more expensive HomePod, but that's not coming out for a while. And of course, like I said at the beginning of this video, there were some rumors earlier this year that were pointing out that the HomePod would be getting Face ID at some point, and I was like, why? Pretty much anyone can activate the Google Assistant on the Google Home Mini. It's kind of free of use. It's like if you're in sound range of this device, you're able to access it. I understand that it can understand different voices, but pretty much anyone who calls out commands to it is able to make it do things. They can make it play music, set timers, play games and stuff like that. But while I was interacting with this device and while I've been toying with it, I got this theory because I kept wondering about why, despite technology getting so good at understanding how we mean things, and I think the Google Assistant does a great job at listening to you, as well as understanding what you mean with context, which I have to say is something Google's very good at and Siri's definitely behind on. But what about it still seems so robotic? What about it seems unnatural? When do we get to the point where a digital assistant is pretty much like talking to another human? And I started realizing what the biggest issue was that calling out command that we keep saying in order for the device to start listening to us, which of course with the Google Home Mini is of course by saying, okay Google. So of course what I mean by that is every time you want this thing to listen to you or start taking a command to you, as most companies have found out, the best way to access a digital assistant since you are talking to it is to call out a certain command. And these devices are always on, they're always listening for that certain command. Once that command is activated, they start recording what you say and start interpreting it as an action, which works pretty well, but it definitely means that the conversation you're having with this AI is not necessarily genuine. It's not very fluid because, I mean, think about it. You don't really talk to other people that way. For instance, if I'm talking to my friends, I'm not saying, okay, Xander, how are you doing today? Or, okay, Xander, could you loan me 10 bucks? That's just not how you interact. And that's why I think a lot of what digital assistants do may seem kind of robotic, and that's why I feel like the intuitiveness of it is a bit awkward when you're talking to a device and you're constantly having to tell it to do things. For instance, if you say, okay, Google, play this song, and it starts playing that song, and then turns out it might have gotten it wrong, or actually you don't want it to play that song, so in a more genuine conversation, if you were talking to it as you would talk to a person, you would just say, oh, no, stop. You shouldn't have to necessarily say, okay, Google, stop, because that's not how you would talk in a real conversation. So where this all comes back around is that I think that perhaps Face ID on the HomePod is not necessarily an unlocking system. It does seem rather bizarre that on a device that is not mobile, the next generation HomePod would be sitting in a single location wherever it's plugged in. Face ID does not work that terribly far away, so why would you want to unlock certain parts of your HomePod by getting up really close to it like you have to do with your iPhone 10, but of course that's a product you hold in your hand, so it makes sense that Face ID works there. On a speaker, it doesn't make sense. What I'm theorizing is that perhaps Face ID is not being an unlocking mechanism. The sensors we're using Face ID for now will be implemented into the HomePod, and in that way, you won't be calling out to the HomePod and saying, hey Siri, to activate it. Instead, you could simply look at the device you're referring to. One issue I can already see having with the Google Home Mini is more and more products you may buy, or more and more Siri-enabled devices you may buy, such as we were figuring out that the iMac Pro might have that always-on listening Siri mode. Your watch has it, your phone has it. Lots of people now are buying these, and they're buying lots of them. They put them all over their house, or they have lots of Amazon Echoes all over their house, that when you call out that certain command, it'll start to activate lots of them. Perhaps what Apple is onto, and of course this is still theoretical, the reason I wanted to talk about this is I don't hear anyone theorizing about this, is that perhaps these visual camera sensors they're implementing into the HomePod are to face track you and only start listening happen when they register that the user's eyes are now pointing at the device itself. So imagine this. Next generation HomePod, okay? We don't even have the first gen out yet, I know. But I think this could be really cool potential idea, and if another company introduces it first, I want to point back to this video and be like, hey, my idea. Instead of calling out to the Google Assistant every time you wanted to do something, like Google stop, Google play this song, Google turn up the volume, Google do this, which doesn't feel right. Instead, it only starts listening when you're looking at it. I think that's more realistic in how natural you would talk to another person. Typically, with my friends at least, I don't know how you guys are, but when I need to talk to them, I can just be in the room with them or just make eye contact, or not necessarily require them to make eye contact, but as long as I'm looking at them and I say, could you do this? They understand that I'm talking to them. So if a computer could start doing that, if we had these visual cameras installed on our smart tech with our digital assistants, that means that perhaps with HomePod similar technology, it doesn't necessarily have to be Apple, it could be Amazon or Google, anyone. Whenever I'm looking at the device, it starts listening. And I think that would be more genuine, because it could be like walking into the office, closing the door, locking everything up, and I go, play that song. And just by looking at the device, it knows I'm referring to it and can therefore register that command and take action on it, instead of me saying, Google do this, Google do this. Or perhaps it's playing music and I don't really want it to be playing it anymore. So I walk in the room and I just go, stop, instead of, okay, Google, stop, which gets a little bit tedious, and like I've mentioned a million times, doesn't feel natural. It's not how you would talk to a person. And if we're talking more long distance tech, of course, this is not something I expect to be available really in 2018. Perhaps this is a 2019 technology or even beyond. But if we're talking even further than that, if we get to that stage, perhaps in 2019 or 2020, when Apple starts developing AR glasses, this is another great opportunity in which adding that extra bit of hardware, so AR glasses that project on top of your vision, using those on a day-to-day basis could suddenly change the way you access your digital assistants, because it would have eye tracking. It would know exactly where you're looking, and then you wouldn't have to have those dot projectors and infrared sensors and cameras all over your devices so they know when you're looking at them. Instead, AR glasses could communicate with all your tech and tell it when you are looking at it. So instead of calling out Siri and having all of your devices go off at the same time, you just look at one, tell it what to do, and now it knows what to do. Of course, I understand there would be difficulties with this technology. Of course, it would have to understand context very well, because I'm sure there would be plenty of times where you're looking at your smart speaker or smartphone and are talking while looking at it, but you don't necessarily want it to do anything, which would mean that the AI would have to be smart enough to know what he's saying right now is not necessarily a command. He's just talking about me, he's talking to someone else. So I understand there could be complications with this idea, but I definitely think that one of the biggest issues I have with digital assistants right now, because, you know, the Google Assistant I do think is the smartest. I don't think Siri can hold up to that, but I'm not a big fan of really either. I think they're really good at doing very basic things, playing music, setting timers, texting people. I mean, fairly basic things that you can still do just with your fingers anyway. Touch screens are pretty reliable, and you don't have to articulate it very perfectly so that the computer understands you. What I think companies want to do is make these digital assistants feel more like people and feel more like you're just talking to someone, not talking to a machine. If that's the end goal, I think by getting rid of that call-out feature of constantly having to repeat its name every time you want to give it a command could drastically be fixed if these visual sensors were put on the device and could understand whenever you are looking at it. That way, it would know when to start listening and when to take an action. And of course, this is all theoretical. I have not read about this. This is a total idea of mine, a concept of mine, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts about it. So please let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd be very curious to hear about this discussion. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you in the next one.